So remember surprise mechanics? Well, that all came from a UK Parliament hearing, and as it turns out, there's a lot more where that came from. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. So, while I am on holiday, it does seem that industry news is attempting to pull me home, because today we do have to talk about the UK Parliament. So the UK Parliament inquiry on immersive and addictive technologies is continuing, and again they've been focusing on loot boxes. Now this meeting was a discussion between the UK Minister for Digital and the Creative Industries, Margot James, and the Commons Committee. Now this committee started off by asking what James thought about loot boxes, mentioning that EA bizarrely called them surprise mechanics, mentioning that since then they've received correspondence from gamers likening them to gambling, and bringing up the ban in other regions like the Netherlands and Belgium, with the committee asking if the UK should catch up. Well, James responded by saying there were a number of assumptions in the committee's questioning, considering that those other countries like the Netherlands and Belgium handle offline gambling differently, and that the UK's laws focus on activity involved in a game of pure chance. And she also contested the assumption that loot boxes are gambling, saying that the evidence presented to the committee does not necessarily support that. Now, she explains that loot boxes are a means of people purchasing items to enhance their gaming experience, not an expectation of a financial reward, and that they cannot be cashed out. And sure, she does make some solid enough points there, but it does kind of read like copy from EA, doesn't it? And it's not universal. There are instances, like in CSGO, where you can kind of cash out. In a case like, say, FIFA, or any game that allows for player auctions or trading, real money trading does exist, where players can cash out via selling FIFA coins on black market websites. Now, it's hard to know where to assign the blame here when, a black or grey market exists as a side effect of player trading and the value that players ascribe to items. Though that said, if games were not designed with such a blatant focus on pay to win, like with FIFA, then maybe it would be less of an issue. There's also the comparison to their definition of gambling, which is that the player rolls are pure chance, but there's more to talk about on that topic later. Now, a committee member asked if she was unconcerned about loot boxes, and she said that she didn't say that as a reply. And she did go on to say that if there is evidence presented that loot boxes can lead to a gambling problem, then she would be concerned by that, saying that with reference to young people, they would need to take that seriously and actually take action. Now, she doesn't think the evidence is there, though, and there are not many relevant studios in her mind that, just not enough, basically, that they are justified in starting regulation. Now, this is something that I can kind of understand. Once regulations start, it's kind of hard to walk them back. From a governmental point of view, they will want it to be a far more prevalent problem in the eyes of the general public before they go hard on regulation, especially when the UK game sector is doing quite well, and they would not want to do anything that could be seen to constrict that. Of course, Margot James is involved in that sector as a part of her role as the Digital and Culture Minister, so that's relevant and worth keeping in mind. Now, they went on to discuss the existing evidence, wherein Dr. David Zendel identified links between loot boxes and gambling. Now, Margot James warned that that work is correlational, and I think it is very easy to confuse correlation and causation, and James is right when she says that you can't assume there is a causal link. There is a point there, right? It's easy to assume that correlation means causation when it's happening in the direction of the argument that you support, but ultimately, to pass, the standards of a government review, we do need more than that. We do need very good research and evidence. Now, that being said, I do think it's pretty darn clear that something majorly psychologically potent is going on with loot boxes and with a lot of that game design. And now, whether you call it gambling or not, I don't think that really matters. It's quite clear that for some personality types, bad behavior and exploitation can actually happen. Now, James says that her department and the Gambling Commission are discussing the issue. She explained that it's a young area of research and they need to get a better understanding of the root causes before they regulate to curb symptoms. Of course, with addiction in all forms, treating the symptom could ultimately just be ignoring the underlying underlying cause of the behavior, and they do need to actively look for evidence to, remain objective there. And I do sort of tend to agree. Addictive personalities are not going to be cured if loot boxes are banned. Those addictions will just continue to be found elsewhere. Now, that's not to say that doing something about loot boxes shouldn't be considered as an option to maybe reduce exposure or potential triggers, or do something like that to sort of pragmatically deal with the immediate problem, but I think it's important not to be overly blinded by goals and still instead remain focused on the first principles cause of the problem. In this case, it's addictive personalities, and our more immediate issue is the games industry pretty much exploiting those. Now, they then took a detour over to gaming addiction and the WHO's recent classification of gaming disorder. James started by saying that only around 1% of gamers have problems with this, which is definitely a questionable statistic. Even just what does gamer even mean as a definition? But beyond that, she reiterated the approach to loot boxes, saying that they're not denying that people can have serious problems, but that the evidence is not there to the degree where they need to act. She stresses that even the WHO acknowledged that more research is needed in the field, and that said, she does believe that games companies should take this stuff seriously and should support users who spend excessive time in their games through things like alerts and reminders. And I think that's a fair idea, but I've got to admit, I think it would be pretty obnoxious if I was immersed in a game and then just got told to take a break. And this really does actually go very south in this committee, very badly. The committee then suggests the UK should seek limits for younger players, like what Tencent do in China for some of their games. 1 hour per day for under 12s, 2 hours per day for those between 13 and 18. And honestly, neither government nor industry should be taking this kind of responsibility away from parents. Basically, just about every way of playing a game has some form of parental control that lets you set time limits and things like that, so it makes this a bit of a moot point. And imagine limiting a kid to an hour of a movie, or 2 hours of a movie, or music, or a book, or any form of art. There are fantastic games out there that are emotionally powerful experiences that do not work with arbitrary time limits like that. I think that's a real constriction in art. I think this talk is insane, and this is what I would caution everyone against. The same government people who are thinking about regulating loot boxes, which you may want, they're also, as you can see here, the same people who are considering China-like restrictions on freedom and the state encroaching on what should be the role of parents. So whenever you see gaming pundits blindly support this stuff, you've got to just take a step back and think, hang on, what else do these people want? Because yes, you might get your loot box regulation, but is that going to further embolden those same people to start putting in time restrictions for playing games? And that's something that I think we really do not want to happen. Now, while that's my take, Margot James did address that quite differently, instead saying that Southeast Asia is a lot different from the UK and that we cannot use a solution from elsewhere because we are culturally different. She mentions anecdotes about parents from that part of the world who are happy enough to see their kids gaming because it's a healthy break from studying. She says that much of the research in game addiction right now is from SEA regions, and that we need a lot more in the UK and the West, which, I mean, if that's true, fair enough. More research is probably an okay thing, assuming it's, good research. After that, though, they went back to talking about gambling in games and how it relates to games of choice. And I think this is where Margot James messed up and showed a bit of a lack of understanding in games. The committee said that the nature of loot boxes evokes the feeling of gambling in children because of the chance-based nature, despite there being no monetary value. It still evokes the gambling feeling, essentially. Now, she responded by saying that there was a lot of skill involved in games and that she takes issue with the way that the committee have extrapolated the definition of game of chance. And I do think she's largely wrong here. While many games are of course matters of skill, undoubtedly, well, loot boxes are separate, and they pretty much are a pure chance-based reward. I mean, if loot boxes were implemented in games like, say, a claw machine where you grabbed the item you wanted, maybe her point would stand a little bit better. However, loot boxes, I think, are covered by being pure chance. Now, she does admit one thing, though, and that is that if pay-to-win mechanics are there, it could be a lot more dangerous than, say, just cosmetics only, and that could contribute to a gambling problem. Now, she goes on to explain her biggest concern, which is not gambling, but that children or young young people are spending excessive quantities of money on in-app purchases, which could be made worse if loot boxes rely on a propensity to gamble. Now, this is particularly pertinent when given the recent story on the BBC with 4 young children, each under the age of 10, who emptied their parents' bank accounts via FIFA on a Switch, which I think amounted to about £550 in spending over 3 weeks on the Switch version of FIFA 19. The father basically didn't realize that the appropriate protections were not set up on the Nintendo account before they knew that the money was gone. Thankfully for the family, though, Nintendo did agree to a full refund, and they removed the purchase players and packs from the account. Now, this stuff absolutely is a problem, and I think it's one that publishers should be absolutely ashamed of, because they're clearly more than happy to profit from it. From a legal angle, though, I think this ultimately is the matter of parents making sure that their children are properly educated and prepared. Ultimately, parents can't just entirely disengage from their children's hobbies and not monitor them and not be involved. That's irresponsible parenting. And the tools in this case are there for them to prevent these problems. Now, that's not to give the industry a pass. This whole thing does stem from abusive game design. Now, the committee then did bring up concerns about Fortnite addiction, and James sort of agreed with elements of what they said. She said that some companies involved gave the impression that they only cared about the game's success, rather than the impact on the players. Like others in the industry, she says that's not an attitude that can prevail in the medium term. She said, "I don't think it's good enough to create a game and wash their hands of the potential consequences." And I think that is a statement that is universally agreeable. Now, she says that's not the attitude of many of the companies that she deals with, but that there definitely are some, and I suppose no prizes for guessing who those companies may be. James then goes on to say that they have a responsibility to learn from data and that there are measures that could be put in place. She cautions that the industry shouldn't be the only one performing the research and that the government needs to ensure that research is independent and, where possible, make use of public spending. She hints at somewhat of a deadline too, saying that companies will have to demonstrate their duty of care to the user base over the next 18 months before the online harms regulator comes into play. She mentions that she agrees on concerns about companies having access to data that they're not making use of, or, letting other parties in on. The quote is, "If they're not sharing it, perhaps it's time they did." That's a thinly veiled threat if I ever saw one, though, it does reek of government data harvesting, which I also really don't like. Now, for context here, the online harms regulator, that is a proposed plan to make companies more responsible for user safety online, and it seems that James knows that they'll have their sights on some of these harmful industry practices, but that said, it could be another government power grab that is slurping up data, which of course I'm concerned about. As said before, I don't think any of us want hardline government regulations to limit what the industry can offer overall, but I think some companies are definitely ruining that for others. And really, that's the thing. We don't want regulation, but some bad actors could end up forcing it. Now, the discussion ends with her addressing concerns on the freemium model, which the committee fears incentivizes long playtime and psychological trickery to encourage spending. And she actually said that she agrees this can happen, but is not always the case. She explains that, like in any industry, there are some who are in it for the short term. That's not true of all of them. There are many who are, of course, there for the long term and do have a responsible attitude, but there are others who are aggressively monetizing that do need to be brought in line. So to wrap this whole thing up, Margot James is trying to walk quite a fine line. She should want what is best for the industry growth in her, that is her role, basically, right? And her reluctance to regulate, that's fairly telling of her background, both as a Conservative MP and a business owner. Now, she has placated some of the committee's fears here. She did, pay lip service to them, but it's clear that she doesn't really understand the whole picture. Her replies here are focused on the definition of gambling rather than the experience to the users. I think as an official, her job is to ensure that they step in whenever the market is not correcting itself to healthier behaviors once evidence is presented, and I think she's done a reasonable enough job. That said, I think it's pretty clear to us in games that action needs to be taken somehow by somebody, as it doesn't appear that the industry is going to be able to step up. As an outsider to games, she doesn't seem to have a massive understanding of how insidious and how deliberate some of these design decisions can actually be. Basically, you can talk about the definition of gambling all day long, and there maybe are steps to take there, but that might be addressing a symptom. Because really the disease is a lot of modern game design trends. Mobile game publishers, the likes of, say, EA also, designing psychological spending traps first and video games second. It's reprehensible, and I think genuine feedback and complaints from users are doing nothing. Ultimately, this is a problem that should be solved by the market first, then the industry, and then government. And so far, the market hasn't done it, the industry certainly isn't doing it, so it's a shame that it seems to maybe fall to the government, since FIFA's Ultimate Team shows no signs of improving in terms of how it is as a business practice, yet it still is pulling in insane revenue, and many in the industry are willfully blind to the long-term damage that it could do. I just hope that the government regulates with surgical precision if they choose to, instead of the giant mallet they usually use. So there you go, that's another video. Do let me know what you think on this stuff about government regulation, industry regulation, where the market should come in. And I suppose it just all, to me, comes back to that awkward problem where ultimately users shouldn't accept these bad things, yet clearly with this being an entertainment product, a lot of users do. And that means that the market is not really providing that much resistance, which means that it's still profitable for the industry to do, which means that things will just get worse and worse to the point now where, yeah, gamers are calling on their own industry being regulated because there's so much of a disconnect between gamers and I suppose the AAA publishers. It's a pretty darn sad state of affairs, and I'd love to hear what you've got to say about it down below. But with that said, that's it for me today. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.